Does employer pedigree matter in your career? Well, stick around because as a corporate recruiter, I'm going to give you my insight into what we think about big versus small companies. Hey everybody, it's Brian from A Life After Layoff, and today I want to talk to you about employer pedigree. So the idea of working at a big company versus a small company, and is there a difference from an employer's perspective? So I want to go over the pros and the cons of each one. Now, as a corporate recruiter with over 20 years of experience, I've actually had the opportunity to work in some of the world's most well-known and well-recognized companies. And on the flip side, I've actually had a chance to work with some smaller companies that you'd consider kind of mom and pop. So I've seen both sides of the spectrum. And I'm going to give you my opinion from both working in these types of companies and then also from an employer's perspective of which one is more desirable for us as we're going out and recruiting new talent. So somebody did ask me the question, does it matter what kind of employer that I work for? In other words, working for a well-known Fortune 100 company versus working for some kind of company that nobody's ever heard of before. Does that matter when you're out on the job market? So it got me thinking, actually from an employer's perspective, there are some differences that you should be aware of. So when you're going through a recruitment process, or if you're in the process of looking for a new position, you might want to consider it as you build your career. So I think the first thing we want to talk about is brand recognition itself. Now, working for a major corporation that everybody's heard of and is well regarded in the industry as being an industry leader versus working for a company that nobody's ever heard of before, you really are looking at that brand recognition as a pretty important advantage that a big corporation has. And like it or not, it actually does make a difference. When you are applying for positions, and I'm just thinking, and this is me putting my recruiter hat on, when I'm looking at candidates across the board and I see 100 candidates and 90 of them have companies that I've never heard of before, but I see something that a candidate that might have GE or some big company that I've heard of and I know has best-in-class business practices, I'm going to take a closer look at that person at GE because there is a high likelihood that they are used to working in large matrixed environments. The idea of putting them into a company that I work at that's going to be large and matrixed and distributed and all that kind of stuff is not going to necessarily be overwhelming for them. Whereas if you worked at a small mom and pop company, you're just not going to have that same brand recognition. The phone probably isn't going to ring as much as the person who has the well-regarded company on their resume. So it's a kind of a thing of like it or not. That's just kind of how it is. You are going to find yourself at a disadvantage as a job seeker if you are working for a series of companies that are relatively small and under the radar. Doesn't mean that you have bad experience. Doesn't mean that you can't get best-in-class business practice experience working at those companies. It's just that in the open market, you're not going to get the benefit of the doubt the way that somebody working at a Fortune 100 company would. So that's something to keep into consideration. And here's another unfortunate or fortunate thing, I guess, depending on what side of the fence you're on. But there are some hiring managers at companies that I've worked for, in particular the big companies, who do certainly have a bias toward wanting people to come from pedigree. I'm not saying that every major corporation is like that, or even there are corporations where the overall corporation doesn't have that requirement, but there are individual hiring managers that have it, that there's a bias toward the pedigree of the company that you've come from. So they want to see companies, a lot of times I see it potentially in, use accounting, for example, Big Four. If you see somebody coming from the Big Four, they'll say on the job description, we want somebody from the Big Four. So if you have a Big Four experience, that means you've worked at a major accounting corporation. You know the best-in-class business practices that are standard, the standard level of kind of where the bar is set. You're going to have at least a baseline level if you've come from one of those Big Fours, right? So that would be a hiring manager's perspective. They're saying, we really want somebody that has pedigree in their background. Now, there might be another hiring manager in the same company that says, I don't really care about the pedigree so long as they've done the work that I'm looking to do. Where you can get into another disadvantage is just the size and the scope. If you're coming into a company that is massive and the type of technology, for example, that you're working on impacts multiple organizations or is distributed across multiple organizations, and you've only worked in a company that is very targeted or just has maybe one pillar of work that they can really impact, you're probably going to be in over your head as far as the size and the scale. If you're coming into a major, I'm thinking like a Fortune 50 company or bigger, big, massive corporations. So you'll be at a disadvantage. So like it or not, I think you got to give the advantage from a brand recognition perspective. It's really not even a close call here. You got to give the advantage to a major corporation. So if you are trying to make a consideration for what type of employer to target based on brand recognition, you've got to go with the big corporation that you've heard of. The second major thing is, and this kind of plays a part in the type of organization, the size of the organization as well, is thinking in terms of technology and business practices. So smaller companies, and I found this personally to be true, smaller companies tend to not pivot with the latest in technology. They kind of find what works for them, they get into a groove, and if you spend any given amount of time at a particular organization, you're going to get kind of stuck into that way of doing things. Whereas when you look at a bigger corporation, the latest technology, the latest kind of buzzwords, the latest in software, the latest in technology that you're using is always coming in. They're trying new things. They're kind of pivoting. They're almost steering where the market is going. It's kind of the cutting edge. So if you are working in a small mom and pop shop and you suddenly find yourself unemployed, or you're looking for a new position, and you worked at that small company, you may find yourself at a disadvantage in the open market when you come out and realize, man, the market is really passing by as far as the type of technology people are working on. Maybe it's a new software that everybody has come up to speed with, or maybe it's a new work methodology that everybody is using now in the open market, and your company just didn't adopt it or adapt to it when you were working there, and maybe you spent a bunch of years there, and now you suddenly find yourself kind of behind the eight ball compared to all of those other people that you're competing against in the open market, and you're finding yourself not really stacking up to the minimum requirements of the position. So I'm not saying that small companies don't or can't have the latest and cutting edge technology, but I think you're going to find major corporations just have budgets for that kind of stuff. They are bringing in a lot of diverse people that are typically coming in from other organizations that are doing it and bringing in best practices, and so you're kind of getting a melting pot of best practices from just the employee populations you're going to be surrounded by. So that's the second major thing to consider. I think you got to give the advantage for business processes to technology. You got to give it to the big organization as well. Another thing to think about, and this is from a small company's perspective that might have a good advantage, is the ability to take that technology or something that you're working on and see it directly impact the bottom line or the customer that you're working with. If you're working in a huge organization and you just might be a cog in a wheel, and you might be working on your individual project, but it's part of a much bigger project, and your little piece to that project, while it's important and critical, you can't necessarily see that entire thing impact on the open market. Whereas when you are working for a much smaller company, what you're working on might be directly impacted. And when I worked for a small company, that was the thing I really liked about it, is what I was working on, I could actually go and see it in practice. I could see what I did, and I could go on their website and go, oh, I did all that work. Whereas if you work for a huge company, you can kind of get lost in the crowd because it's just such a massive machine. So if you're interested in really seeing your work impact the bottom line of the business, seeing your work impact customer experience, then you've got to go with that small company if that's something that's more important to you. So the small company would definitely have an advantage there. Now, I think the same thing goes for work culture. When you look at a cultural perspective, when you get into a much bigger corporation, you're looking at usually it's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of business practices that come into play. And I think as you start as a small company, as a startup, for example, where it's the smallest and you're kind of got all that synergy, and it's kind of like a cowboy-like environment where they're, kind of everybody's all hands on deck doing things that aren't even part of their job description. But it's a lot of long hours. Typically, it's a really close-knit group, kind of family environment in a lot of cases. And then as an organization grows, they kind of grow from a small startup mode to a small company where you need to start having some business practices, but you can still pivot pretty quickly, take advantage of market conditions. It's like kind of I think it's like a sports car or a speedboat. You can kind of turn and pivot really quickly and catch the next wave. Whereas as you get bigger as a company, as you start to see success, the company grows, now you need to start having business practices or business processes that come in to manage all of these parts. Because as you grow in size, you grow in employees, obviously, there needs to be some sort of control over those different moving pieces, especially as you distribute out to different geographic regions. From a perspective of centralized control, you need to make sure that everything's consistent. So the only way to do that is through business processes and business practices that then get distributed across all those different channels. So you start to get more red tape now, and as you grow into a large corporation and even a humongous corporation, it's almost like now you are kind of like a cruise ship or a container ship, where it's just this massive barge that's moving through the water, and in order to make it go even a couple of degrees this way, you've got to turn it a massive amount. It takes a long time. It could take it a mile or two to stop in open water. So it's a massive, there's a massive kind of machine behind it. So behind those machines, if you're having so many, you get into 100,000 plus employees, the only way to manage a business that size is to have a lot of standardized business practices, processes, technology that is all standardized and really closely monitored. Otherwise, the corporation will just spin out of control. So if you are somebody that likes an environment where you kind of have a cowboy-like Wild West, you kind of all hands on deck, you kind of do what you want so long as you get the job done, kind of not a win at all costs, but a whatever it takes to win kind of mentality, then a small company is going to be a much better fit. If you're somebody that doesn't do well in a very structured environment, or can follow very strict business practices, then you're probably going to be miserable in a large corporation, because a large corporation just inevitably has to have that stuff, and you just couldn't manage your business without it. So I would say it really just depends on the type of person that you are. If you can work well in a structured environment and you don't mind the red tape, in order to, if you want to order a new stapler for your desk, you have to go through a series of approvals, and then you have to go through all this stuff just to get a stapler, versus a small, a big company, a small company, you can just go off and get yourself a stapler and then just expense it, and then you're done. So it really just depends on the kind of environment that you're comfortable with. It's kind of, I'd say it's kind of a wash. Maybe I would give it a slight advantage to the small company, because I think a lot of us like to have freedom and flexibility. But there are some people that enjoy that big machine. So I would probably put that as advantage to a small company, but it really just depends on your personality type. The next major thing that I think and this is going to be a no-brainer, the compensation. Big corporations just have a lot more resources than small companies. And it's not to say that with small companies they can't compete, but in most cases a large corporation is going to have a lot more resources. They're going to have healthier salary bands. In almost every case, the major corporations that I've worked with, we can pay a lot more for talent, especially if it's a competitive market, if you work in a competitive environment, if you're very in demand, your job type, if you're a software developer, you can write your check. If you go to one of the big fangs, you can basically name your number to a degree. And there's just no comparison. Now, a small company has to sell you on opportunity, and you're really going to sacrifice cash compensation for potential future maybe stock options, or maybe just the type of work that you'd be doing, or maybe it's promotional opportunities, but they're going to have to get you some other way to feel whole. So if you're looking at compensation strictly from a cash perspective, or maybe benefits, there's really just there's no comparison. A major corporation is going to have a whole lot more of a healthy compensation package that they'll be able to offer you. Now, let's look at career growth. So if you are somebody that is interested in moving up the corporate ladder, I think you can make a case for both the small and the large company. The small company, it's easier to get recognized because there's not nearly as many people that you're kind of competing to show that you're a rising star on. So if you work in a small company, you buckle down and you really do a good job, you can get recognized and move into a kind of a title position quicker. However, if you are in a large corporation, there's going to be a lot more opportunities to move inside of the organization. So you're going to have a lot more opportunities. So maybe in a small corporation, you have to take your boss's job and then your boss's job, and maybe that's not something that you're really that interested in. There's just not a whole lot of other moves that you can make that would kind of position you out of that into the career path that you wanted. Whereas if you're in a major corporation and you're already on the inside, it's a lot easier to then pivot to a lot of different, in major corporations, even in, let's use HR, for example. In HR, there's probably 30 or 40 different mini pillars that you can specialize in. And if you don't want to be a generalist, an HR generalist, you can go into recruiting, like TA. You can go into subgroups of recruiting. In some major corporations, they even have diversity recruiting, or they even have internal processes or HRIS systems. So there's really tons of different avenues that you can go in with a major corporation, whereas at a small company, there's just not going to be that level of depth. So while I think you can move up into a position of power probably quicker at a small company, when you look at the large corporations, you're just going to have a much stronger career path as far as growth opportunities. And then when you couple that with the brand recognition on the open market, I think you're going to be somebody that's going to be a lot more in demand. You'll be able to write that check kind of where you want to go if you've strategically played your chess pieces correctly. So that's another thing to consider. And then I think for some of you, especially if you are in maybe an area that you are not that happy with, looking at relocation opportunities. With a smaller corporation, you're just not going to have nearly as many opportunities. They may be limited to geographic regions that they are operating in. Maybe there's just not a lot of opportunity to move to different locations, and maybe they just don't have the financial background or backing in order to really do those kind of geographic moves for you. Whereas a major corporation, if you are interested in going into a certain geographic region and you're in demand, you can pretty much guarantee that you're going to be able to get a decent relocation package associated with that, or the opportunity even to transfer to different locations that might be more advantageous for you and your family. So if you took a job somewhere and your wife is miserable and doesn't want to live there anymore, major corporation might have something in your hometown or close to your hometown or her hometown, and then, or he or she's hometown, I should say, and then you can, typically it's more, there's more flexibility there to be able to relocate. So I think when you look at the overall, is working for pedigree better than working for a company that's kind of unheard of? I think you can really get involved in exciting technology on both sides. So I really think it boils down to what your personal preference is. I think strictly from a career perspective, as a recruiter that's worked in major corporations and small corporations, I think the average job seeker is going to have a stronger career path if you can get some pedigree on your resume at some point. Doesn't mean you have to work your entire career in pedigree, but if you can get fairly recent high pedigree on your resume, it's kind of like rocket fuel for you. So something to think about. So if you're especially if you're early in your career and you're watching this, try to get that pedigree job early into your career, because that will set you up for the next major steps, and that'll help you get into even those startup companies that, even though it's a different skill set, and they actually may look for a different skill set, I think you're going to find yourself with a lot more opportunity in the long term if you've got some pedigree and kind of blend it. I think it's actually great to have both eventually on your career. Pedigree is going to get your foot in the door in a lot more places than a small company. That's kind of the bottom line, and you're probably going to have higher compensation. So if those things are important to you, then try for pedigree. If you are more interested in the type of work that you're doing and making a direct impact that you can see, I think then small companies are the way to go. If you are looking for help trying to get into either pedigree companies or small companies for that matter, I actually have something that I do specialize in. I've got a website called alifeafterlayoff.com. It is full of tips and tricks on how to get noticed by recruiters at major corporations. So if you are looking for that pedigree and you're looking for the insider's edge, make sure you check out that website. It's called lifeafterlayoff.com, and I'm going to leave a link for that below. I've also got a free 5-day boot camp for job seekers. So if you are looking for how to get noticed by me, make sure you sign up for that. I'm going to leave a link for that as well. Appreciate you stopping by. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. Make sure you hit the like and the subscribe button. The like actually helps other people find this content, and subscribe button is going to allow you to not miss a beat. I'm an insider with 20 years of experience working at a variety of organizations, including some that you've probably used even this week. So you've heard of us, heard of companies that I've worked for. So I've also worked for those mom and pops, so I kind of have both sides of the fence. Anyway, appreciate you stopping by today, and we will see you on the next one.